everyone. So today I'd like to tell you all a bit about a paper that I co-authored on some conceptual problems with internet filtering. And the kind of central idea for this project emerged from a fairly common criticism of internet filters. I suspect it's one that some of you will be familiar with. And that's that internet filters over and under block with some regularity. That is, they sometimes block content that they shouldn't and fail to block content that they should in accordance with some relevant filtering policy. And the available evidence indicates that this is occurring relatively frequently. I don't want to get too bogged down in the various studies available on this, so I'll just kind of mention one, a 2010 meta-study which was compiled by librarian Sarah Hooten-Jan, where she determined that with respect to blocking objectionable content, filters had an average accuracy rate of about 78%. Now, on the surface, the over and under blocking criticism of filters seems pretty intuitive. It probably makes sense to everyone. But one thing that we found interesting about it was that it seemed to presuppose that a filter that only blocks in accordance with an existing policy would be a successful filter. So from this, we ended up with our first driving question for this project, which is, even if existing internet filters could be made to perfectly do what they're designed to do, would this constitute successful internet filtering or merely successful blocking of particular kinds of content? So what I want to do over the next 8 minutes or so is kind of quickly walk you all through our reasoning to get to the answer that we think is most plausible. Let's see how. All right, success. Okay. So the idea of overblocking and of underblocking, for that matter, only really makes sense if we appeal to some distinction between content that should and shouldn't get blocked legitimately. And generally, that's a distinction that gets made via this concept of objectionability. But what does it mean for content to be objectionable, really? Well, we know that people object to content for a very wide range of reasons, some more or less predictable, right, than others. On the slide, I've included a few that are at least anecdotally a little more common. You've probably encountered one or perhaps all of these in some form or another. And one thing that struck us as we discussed these different sorts of objections was that they seem to be structurally similar, even though their substance differed. We eventually came to the conclusion that this is because objections to content are actually objections to problematic interactions. That is, while the content is different in these three cases, they all seem to be about interactions with some information that will purportedly affect the reader or the viewer in particular ways that the objector deems harmful. What this means is that these sorts of objections are often intelligible because we understand them as claims about the ways in which individuals interact with and take up content. So just to take the first example off the top of the slide there, someone who wants to restrict access to materials related to bomb building might maintain a concern about individuals who are inclined to build bombs that they might use to hurt innocent people, maybe people in their community. And in that case, it seems sort of unlikely that that objector is going to retain their concern about the content in the case of, say, a federal investigator evaluating publicly available web content related to bomb building. And so in the paper, we posit that content in a vacuum isn't what people typically object to. And that's because content is in itself not the right kind of thing to be objectionable or unobjectionable. What people are actually objecting to are these problematic interactions that they think occur between a knowing subject and some content. And the knowing subjects that we're interested in here are library patrons, because this is a paper that's very much kind of set in the world of the library. And in thinking about how to conceptualize library patrons and their position in all of this, we landed on the concept of the situated knower. This comes out of feminist social epistemology, and it's essentially a critical response to the homogeneous, anonymous, sort of interchangeable knowers of classical epistemology. Feminist epistemologists have looked at how knowers are embedded and positioned in ways that are fundamentally social. So a knower on this view is, and I'm quoting Elizabeth Anderson here, situated in particular relations to what is known and to other knowers. I think that this concept is in some form going to be necessary to understanding library patrons as individuals and as community members. So it helps us to conceptualize them as this differentiated knowers with diverse perspectives and cognitive styles, intersecting identities and divergent epistemic resources. My hope is also that the concept is going to seem fairly intuitive to librarians, who I think are already largely acknowledging their patrons as situated in larger epistemic communities. So at this point, I want to return to our original motivating question. Even if existing internet filters were made to perfectly do what they're designed to do, would this constitute successful internet filtering? Well, we think the answer is no. And that's because an effective internet filter needs to prevent these problematic interactions that I've been talking about. To do that, internet filters would need accurate information about the situated knower, the content, and the interaction between the two. And that's information that they simply do not have. Without access to that information, they're always going to be sort of conceptually capable of failure. Now, this leads us right to the question that we used in the title of the paper, which was, what would it take for an internet filter to actually work? As you can see from some of the examples listed on the slide, the ideal filter would need a massive amount of information to always and only prevent problematic interactions. For instance, it would need accurate information about an individual patron's knowledge state, emotional state, intentions, interpretive power, social support, and epistemic community, probably more things. Those were the ones we came up with. This is in addition to the filter's need for heuristics to govern its expectations about how those particular states are going to interact with the content in question. The filter would also need information about the content, right, the kind of other half of this interaction, and about the effects that this particular text, broadly construed, would have on this particular person. So it would need to be able to evaluate the text and its subtext, along with any potential misreadings the patron might employ, just for example. Here, it's especially important to see that even if patrons were happy to supply like a bunch of private information, and we were equally happy to receive it, much of this information that the filter needs would still be inaccessible to the patron herself. So things like the misreadings or misinterpretations that I just mentioned would be one example of this. What this means is that the patron couldn't supply all of this information even if she wanted to. So for that reason, we determined that an ideal filter would need to possess mind reading and fortune-telling powers, along with superb psychological judgment in order to always and only prevent problematic interactions. So I know at this point, this paper takes on a strange kind of minority report-ish flavor, but we think that mind-reading fortune-telling filters get at what it would mean for a filter to be truly successful, given how we're understanding this kind of interactional basis for objectionability and how that bears on the telos of internet filtering. So for the sake of clarity, I should probably say that we do not endorse such a filter. Mind-reading filters, obviously bad, present myriad ethical problems related to intellectual freedom and privacy, among other things. But I also think that our analysis here has some really interesting implications for how we talk about the problem of contemporary internet filters. So, for instance, for me, it remains something of an open question as to whether the typical over-under-blocking criticism cedes too much ground to the person who wants to abridge intellectual freedom. And if it does, we may need to rethink how we make this very worthwhile case against internet filters. And in our paper, we also suggest that mind reading in the library isn't merely a speculative conceit. It seems like it might be occurring in a kind of crude form. For instance, when librarians are asked to evaluate patrons' like individual requests to have some content unblocked or to have a filter temporarily disabled at their workstation. So in those cases, unless librarians just comply with any and all requests without question, it seems that the librarian is going to have to engage in a kind of mind reading here in order to make a judgment based on the content in question and like the person standing in front of them. But the big difference between the librarian and the magical sci-fi filters we've discussed in our paper is that the librarian, by virtue of being a human being, is going to make use of all sorts of problematic heuristics and implicit biases to make these judgments. So this is a phenomenon that's all kind of tied up in librarians' everyday diagnostic labor, and we think that LIS scholars should take a closer look at the ways in which present-day librarians are sometimes serving as something like proxy or supplementary mind-reading filters. So that is all I have. I feel like I talked really, really fast. Thank you so much for listening.
We continue our trend of being on time and or with extra time. So does anyone have a long question? David.
Thank you for a great talk. Would you care to comment on how your analysis would bear on situations where the problematic interaction is not between the content and the person accessing it, but in the details of the content's creation, such as child pornography as evidence of a crime, or the visual depiction of a prophet as evidence of blasphemy, or personal details being used as an instrument of revenge or harassment, those kinds of things.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting question, and this particular project doesn't really speak to that. I take it because the kinds of objections you're going to run up against in those cases, like for instance, you mentioned child pornography, are going to be to like the means of production. I take it that's a different style, or like an objection that's different in kind from like a fully sort of content-based objection, if that makes sense. So I think that those are other sorts of kind of, I don't want to say peripheral, relevant issues that are worth investigating, but that we've kind of narrowed what counts as an objection to content here. I don't know if that's satisfying or not. Sure.
Oh, we have a hand with Christine.
Well, it seems like in terms of thinking about reader response, that someone could be a particular mind about various things that they are sensitive about, and a week later feel differently. So it seems like from what you're saying, and maybe I'm not understanding part of it, that it's sort of treating the people as if they're static rather than that they're having dynamic lives where they could change in all sorts of different directions on a daily basis.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point. I think, yeah, there's this sort of assumption that people are sort of, their states are stable, they just remain the same. I think this is why the fortune-telling piece is critical. That, yeah, it's not just enough to kind of be able to read people's minds, but also you would have to have a technology that could predict what would occur down the line. So that's the piece that kind of speaks to that.
Pauline? Pauline.
Hi. Do you compare the imperfect filter with, say, no filter at all? Is no filter at all the a better solution that you're suggesting?
Oh, yes. I think no filter is the best solution. And this is actually one of my concerns with the over-under blocking criticism, is that it implies that, you might even say it doesn't exactly sound like an objection to internet filters. It sort of sounds more like an argument in favor of making them better, which you're going to run up against a lot of different problems, especially if you take our view, where like the perfect filter is the one that does all of these scary, radically invasive things. So yeah, I think the solution is no filters to that problem, at least.
Peter, please.
Okay, so in light of that, I understand the mind reading and fortune telling is, sort of this impossible endeavor. But in a way, we sort of have that with interactions before the library, so between the server and the library, with the whole national security apparatus that we have, which is trying to engage in this sort of mind reading and fortune telling. I feel like they would probably agree with you that the best filter is no filter, because with a lack of a filter, it actually helps in mind reading and fortune telling. So I was just wondering if you could comment on is that something that we should be concerned about at the library end? The fact that beyond the end interaction, if there's somebody somewhere in between that might be trying to predict who the users are, or is that completely separate from?
I mean, so I'll have to admit that I haven't thought about that. I think it's really interesting. It strikes me, at least kind of viscerally, as something that we should be worried about.
it may be outside the scope of this particular project, which is just sort of, proposing this, frankly, sort of strange answer to this conceptual question. But I do think that that's a concern. We need to think about that more.
Thank you.
Illinois.